The Alpha Horizon. Thinking different, acting aware.
Hi, I'm Silvia Merler, Head of Research at Algebris Policy Research Forum, and today I'm going to talk about the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and about the differences between this economic crisis and the crisis that we have seen in the past.
What are the key features of this new crisis hitting global economies?
The crisis that we're facing today is very different in nature from the crisis that we saw, for example, in 2008, because that one was a financial crisis, so born in the financial sector, whereas this one is crisis of the real economy. Pandemics like COVID-19 are, first of all, shocks to the supply. The virus, in fact, reduces, at least temporarily, labor supply for a number of reasons. The most obvious one is that a number of workers will get ill and some of them will unfortunately die. But also the countermeasures that governments are putting in place to slow down the contagion go in the same direction because they basically prevent workers from carrying out their job as normal. I'm thinking about quarantines or lockdown here. And also measures such as school closures go in the same direction of reducing labor productivity or hours worked because they require workers to combine their regular work with the need to take care of children during working hours. The supply shock can then turn into a demand shock through negative spillovers of the reduction in economic activities and working hours through income and consumption of families and individuals. And the uncertainty concerning the duration of the crisis can also lead consumers to save more in a precautionary way compared to what they would normally do, and also goes in the direction of reducing consumption.
It is often said that we are at war with the virus. Looking at the crisis from an economic perspective, do you see similarities to previous wars?
So from a purely economic standpoint, this is a comparison that actually makes sense because wars do have some of the typical features of supply shocks that we have discussed earlier, particularly when it comes to the reduction in labor supply. There is, however, one key difference, which is that in the case of war, at least the wars in the past, we also have seen a very sizable destruction of physical capital, for example, infrastructure or factories due to the bombings. And so what you typically observe after a war is a very significant surge in fixed capital investment to reconstruct not only the economy, but the whole country, actually. And this is something that we are not very likely to experience in the COVID crisis, even though we are certainly going to see an increase in investment in healthcare, which is likely to be permanent.
Some people talk of a new financial crisis. What should we expect?
Absent government's countermeasure, it would be entirely possible that the real economic crisis that we're experiencing right now turns into a financial crisis. The risk there is that some part of our economy that are currently closed or operating below capacity will actually not be able to restart if they remain locked down for too long. And on top of that, you have psychological effects that might be long-term. For example, consumers might be less willing to travel, to go to the cinema, to go to the theater, to crowded places like malls, or even to go out for dinner in a restaurant. So these sectors that are significant within the modern economy might actually face a structural decline in economic activity. And in those sectors, firms might face liquidity crises and even bankruptcies. And in the case of bankruptcies, you could have an increase in non-performing loans on the bank's balance sheet, which might create a significant financial risk.
In your view, what are the best measures to tackle this crisis?
Because this crisis is so complex, featuring a complex combination of supply shocks and demand shocks, the classic politics that you would see in a demand crisis, which is basically to stimulate consumption, might actually be ineffective in this situation. The best recipe is instead to avoid as much as possible that firms go bankrupt and to try and preserve the level of economic activity as it was before the outbreak of the virus in 2019. So what you want to do is freeze your economy and hope that this freezing doesn't have to last for too long. There are a number of tools that government can use to that effect. For example, liquidity for firms and for banks. For example, short-term work schemes to try and preserve the employment levels as much as possible, and also credit guarantees for both banks and firms. Many governments around the world, including the Italian government, have already announced measures from this menu, and we will certainly go back and look into the details of what countries have done in the next episodes of this podcast.
The Alpha Horizon. Thinking different, acting aware.